This is photojournalism, telling stories with images. Lesson 1, talking about photojournalism. Okay, everyday people are bombarded with thousands of visual images. If you're keeping track of the news these days, there are plenty of images in there. The media of this century and beyond will continue the visually oriented and graphic trend that exploded in the latter part of the last century. So that would have been the 1970s all the way up until the 1990s. One of the key components to the success of these visual print publications is photography. Photography is seen in the digital realm so often these days on sites like Pinterest and Instagram and so on. Since the days of the Civil War, photos have served a critical role in the development of our society. The images for a yearbook are no less powerful in creating a historical record, but from a student perspective. No matter what happens in a school, as the coronavirus situation has evolved, we'll always have a yearbook. No matter what happens in the school year, there will always be a yearbook. Photojournalism introduces students to the world of photography and journalism. So now we're getting to the purpose of this unit. You will now learn about the camera and how to use it to tell a story. And these are some of the things such as basics of the camera and how it captures images, settings on the camera and how to use them, how to get the most when faced with different lighting situations, composition of photos, and teamwork in telling the best story with photos. These are just going to be kind of like clip notes or snippets. Whether it's with a mobile phone or a top-of-the-line digital camera, the basic rules and concepts are the same. Okay. Whether it's for publication on social media that lasts for a few seconds or a yearbook that lasts an entire lifetime, photographs document the reality. They show that this really happened. If you can capture high-quality action photos that are full of emotion for your yearbook, you will be capturing the definitive historical record of the year. Lesson 1, the camera and the lens. And for a lot of these, because I don't have a camera with me, I'll be reading through these. Objectives. In this lesson, you'll learn how a camera works to produce images, parts of the camera and what they do, and what things affect the quality of an image and how to work with them. William Thackeray, a writer in the 1800s, said, "The two most engaging powers of a photographer are to make new things familiar and familiar things new." So think about that for a second. The camera is not a new device. Early pinhole cameras date to the ancient Chinese and Greeks. They knew you could project an image through a small hole onto a screen. However, it wasn't until the concept of the camera combined with the photographic process invented in the early 1800s that pictures became standard. With film cameras, light passes through the lens onto film. Today's digital cameras use the same concept, but the light goes through a lens onto an image sensor, much like the iris of the eye. Sensors capture light and convert it into an electrical signal, which it converts into data. The data or images are stored until downloaded. Vocabulary from this first lesson. Aperture is adjusting opening in the lens that controls the amount of light reaching the digital sensor or film. The depth of field is the distance between the nearest and farthest objects in the image that appear in focus. 3 factors influence depth of field: the aperture setting on the lens, the focal length of the lens, and the distance between the camera and the object being photographed. DSLR is the digital single lens reflex camera. Exposure, the sum of aperture, shutter speed, and film sensitivity, or ISO. ISO, the setting on the camera that determines the sensitivity of the sensor to light, or ratings that represent how fast the film can record an image, stands for International Standards Organization, also ASA, or American Standards Association. Focal length of the lens determines the angle of view. Short focal lengths give a wider field of view than longer focal length lenses. Normal lens, these are lenses that approximate the human eye's angle of view. Shutter, a shield that blocks light from reaching the sensor until the photographer presses the shutter release, exposing the image. Telephoto lens, these are lenses with focal lengths of more than 50 millimeters and therefore have a narrower angle of view. For example, 85 millimeters, 200 millimeters, 400 millimeters. Wide-angle lens are lenses with focal lengths of less than 50 mm and therefore have a wider angle of view, for example, 35 mm or 28 mm. Zoom lenses are lenses with variable focal lengths, for instance, 16 to 35 mm, 24 to 70 mm, 70 to 210 mm. So this is just interesting stuff to know in the vocabulary. More concepts. 3 things must come together to get the light onto the film or sensor so it produces a great photo, and these are the shutter speed, ISO, and aperture. Think of them as 3 sides of a triangle. If you shorten one side of a triangle, it affects the other 2. So if you adjust one of the 3 items, say aperture, it will affect the shutter speed and ISO. So aperture is the lens opening. You could see that at the top left side of the triangle. Then there's shutter speed, which is exposure. You see that on the right-hand side of the triangle. Then you see ISO, which is sensitivity, at the bottom, at the base of the triangle, or at the closest side to you in the screen. So aperture goes from deep to depth of field to shallow. Okay. And then shutter speed means freeze. That means that things are not moving. And as the motion gets more intense, meaning that there's less frozen, there's more action, things will be blurred. Okay? And then the green or the noise will go from low to high. So if you shorten one side of the triangle, it will affect the other 2. And if you adjust one of the 3 items, say aperture, it will affect the shutter speed and ISO, just reinforcing that. A wider or larger aperture, identified by a smaller f-stop number, allows more light to be transmitted onto the sensor, and therefore you can use a faster shutter speed. Larger apertures provide a much shallower depth of field than smaller apertures, other conditions being equal. When photographing under low light or when photographing fast action, a wide maximum aperture, for instance, f2.8, f2.0, f1.4 is necessary. So lesson 1 activity, parts and functions. There are many parts of the camera you should not touch, such as the shutter and the lens, as your fingers can leave oil and dirt. The camera's parts should always remain clean. Using your own digital camera or school camera, identify these parts. Now you're just going to have to do this on your own, as I can't see you. So these parts are shutter, and that's the part of the camera that controls the length of time the sensor is exposed to light. The shutter release, and this is the button a photographer presses to expose the sensor to light. And viewfinder, the part of the camera through which photographers look to compose an image. There's the bulb, or B. When set on this shutter speed, the shutter will remain open as long as the photographer depresses the button. Then there's the lens release button. This is a button generally located on the front of the camera that the photographer presses to remove a lens on a single lens reflex camera. Hot shoe, a mount on top of the camera that holds an external flash. Mode dial, this is a dial on most cameras allowing the photographer to switch between modes such as P, program, A, aperture priority, S, shutter priority, or S, manual. Monitor and screen, a screen on the back of the camera allowing the photographer to preview the image, playback images, or change settings. White balance, a camera setting that adjusts for varying types of light, allowing white objects to appear white in the image. So after all this, be sure you know how to turn the camera on and off, turn the on-camera flash on and off, insert, remove, and format the storage card, insert and remove the battery, change the operational mode, such as P for program, A for aperture priority, S for shutter priority, or M for manual. Change the shutter speed regardless of the camera mode. Change the aperture regardless of camera mode. And change the ISO. So these are things you should be able to know. Also, how to set the white balance. Set the resolution of the images being taken, large, medium, small, or raw, how to take a picture, how to view and delete an image, how to mount and remove the lens of the camera, lens on the camera, determine whether the lens is a fixed focal length lens or a zoom lens, determine the focal length of the lens,